Welcome to the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast number 40, Becoming a Regenerative Activist Elder, a journey of healing and renewal, a conversation with the podcast team. This is a special solo episode of the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations. Today, we delve into a topic that strikes at the heart of aging with purpose. What does it mean to be a regenerative activist elder? In a world facing pressing challenges like climate change, social inequality, and environmental degradation, the wisdom of elders is more vital than ever. But this isn't just about passing on knowledge. It's about actively contributing to the regeneration of our planet and society. Together, we explore the path to becoming elders who lead with intention, resilience, and commitment to healing the world for future generations. Join us as we rethink elderhood and embrace our roles as agents of change. In our 40th episode, the Way Forward Regenerative Conversation podcast team engages in a lively dialogue on what it means to become a regenerative activist elder. We examine the challenges and opportunities of elderhood in today's world and share our personal journeys of transformation, from balancing savoring life and contributing to society to exploring how elders can foster long-term regenerative changes. This episode invites listeners to reconsider what it means to mature into elderhood. Through candid reflections, we uncover how elders can shape the future by embracing regenerative activism as a way of life. John Izzo is a best-selling author, speaker, and expert on leadership and social responsibility. With over 4 decades of experience, John has dedicated his career to helping individuals and organizations discover purpose and foster meaningful change. He is deeply committed to exploring the role of elders in creating a regenerative future. Alain Gauthier is an international facilitator, coach, consultant, and author specializing in transformational leadership. With a passion for deep inquiry and systemic change, Alan's work bridges inner development and outer societal impact, empowering leaders and elders to create regenerative practices that support community renewal and well-being. Jim Burke is the producer of the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations and a regenerative activist elder. Jim's career began in healthcare, where he worked as a healthcare provider and manager within the Veterans Administration system for over 25 years. His extensive experience in leadership and service led him to focus on regeneration, community engagement, and environmental activism after retirement. We want to take a moment to thank our sponsors for their continuing support in making the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations possible. A special thanks to Elders Action Network and Elders Climate Action for your dedication to creating a regenerative future and for enabling us to continue these critical conversations. To our listeners, if you found today's episode inspiring, please subscribe to our podcast on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. Your subscription helps us reach more people who are eager to join the movement for a regenerative future. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to having you with us for the next episode. And now for our hosts, Dr. John Izzo and Alain Gauthier.
Hi, I'm Dr. John Izzo, and on behalf of my co-host, Alain Gauthier, and our producer, Jim Burke, who will be joining us today, I want to welcome you to this episode of the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast. We're excited to have you here. As you know, we talk about ideas and issues about the future of humanity and the future of planet and how we can have a positive way forward for both, especially from the perspective of the role that those over 50 can play in making that happen. So it's great to have you here. Now, today we're doing something a little different. We don't have a guest today. This is one of our solo podcasts. And those of you who tune in often know that we do these from time to time. And today we're going to really be tackling 2 questions. The first is, what exactly does it mean to be an elder at this moment in time? And what does it mean in particular to be a regenerative elder? And hold your breath. We'll talk about what that means in a moment. What does it mean to be an elder who is contributing to a regenerative future and a regenerative present? But the second thing is we want to share some of our own personal journeys to this stage of life and how we have navigated the often difficult tension between savoring life and continuing to contribute to the world in a meaningful way. And one of the unique things about this podcast is we really represent three generations of elders. I'm in my mid-60s. Jim, our producer and also co-host today, is in his mid-70s. And Alon, my co-host, is in his mid-80s. So you really have three generations of elders navigating what it means to be an elder, period, and what does it mean to be an elder in this time. Now, Alon, before we get started, I couldn't help but think I've referenced this experience before of about 15, 17 years ago when I was in Tanzania with my friend and colleague, Richard Leiter. And we were spending time with the Iraq tribe in central Tanzania, not IRAQ, but IRAK, not related to the Iraqi people in the Middle East. And we were sitting with the Council of Elders. And they said in their society, as soon as you turned 50, you just automatically became a part of the Council of Elders. And they did say once in a while, someone is kind of an old soul, wise before their time, and we let them in. It's kind of almost an honorary member. And they asked me, so how does the Council of Elders work in your society? And they said in our society, people come to us in the tribe for wisdom. They come to us for advice on important issues for the tribe. And they said, how does it work in your society? And I kind of laughed and said, well, through translation, it doesn't exactly work that way. And it really is what started me on this journey of thinking about elderhood in our society and what it really means to be an elder in a modern urban society like ours. So Alon and Jim, I'm so excited that you're both here today and that we get to talk about this. And by the way, if you're younger and you're not anywhere near your 60s yet, you might say, why is this relevant to you? Well, I'm guessing you all have people in your life, somebody, a parent, an aunt, a mentor, a grandparent, who is either in that stage or approaching that stage. And, I think of a conversation I had recently with a friend of mine's new boyfriend who's in his 40s. And when I was talking about some of our work around elders, he said, my parents could really use that because they're recently retired and they're really both lost. So you may have people in your life who you wonder, boy, I'd like their elderhood to be richer and more contributory. And you could really have an influence on them. So Jim and Alon, let's get started. Great to be here and love your thoughts as we get started.
Alon, before we open up these topics we're going to look at, anything you'd like to say?
Yes, I very much resonate with what John just said. And for me, I didn't call myself an elder before I was about 70, in my mid-70s. I have been trying to define what it is for me to be an elder at this time. And it took me a while. And being part of the Elders Action Network has helped me because I could see the variety of profiles that were there. Some people were very engaged, very active in the climate, etc. Others were more into self-reflection and wanting to sense what was trying to come through them, not just what they were doing in the world. So I'm in the midst of leaning now more toward, if I am more in touch with my own deeper self, let's say, I probably will do things differently in the world. So I am at the stage where I'm trying to see what is the connection between a deeper inner work and a substantial outer work. That's where I am at this time.
Well, Alon, thank you very much. We're actually going to dive deeper into that a little later. But first off, we want to begin with both you and John describing your experience of transitioning to elderhood. How did this happen and what were the stages? And so we're going to start off with John. And John, you've spoken before about the subtle but profound shift into elderhood where priorities begin to change and a new sense of purpose starts to emerge. I know that you've had to let go of certain ambitions while embracing new roles such as mentoring and guiding others. Can you share with us your personal journey into elderhood? What stages did you go through in accepting this transition, and how has it shaped your life?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind for me, Jim, is the difference between being old and being an elder. I was intrigued by what Alon said. We referenced the age wave study recently that most baby boomers say you're not elderly until you're in your 80s. Sorry, Alon. Used to be in the 70s. And so the first thing is, I guess for me, it wasn't really until probably my 64 or so when I really started to think that my life was going to be different. Part of it was psychological and part of it was physical. So physically, I realized that I was slowing down a bit, even though I'm quite active, that some of my powers, if you will, were not going to be there anymore in the same level. And I have a lot of friends much older than me, so I could see it coming. I could see the forecast, if you will. And but the second thing is my priorities began to change. That was the inner dimension. Somehow proving myself wasn't as important anymore, wondering what my status was in the world. And I think for me, part of that is, we realize you're mortal. Now, of course, we all know that when we're 20, but, when you're in your mid 60s, you really start to say, okay, I realize I'm not going to be around forever. And what does it really matter? How much status I have or what other people think of me? And then also for me, there may be some people listening for whom one of the transitions to elderhood is from a focus on money or the accumulation or just making a living to making a difference. For me, that transition really wasn't the case because I feel my whole life as a Presbyterian minister, then as a writer, as a corporate sustainability crusader, that I've always been focused on making a difference. But there was a more subtle shift for me, and then I'll turn it over to you guys, where I think I just realized I don't have as much time as I used to. My ego is not as important to me as it used to. And I really haven't liked for a long time, the trends going on in the world. And I thought I only have so much time left. And what does it mean? And then the other thing, maybe I say one more thing. For years, I was the youngest guy in the room. Then I was like in the middle of the pack. Now, often, especially in business circles, I am by far the oldest guy in the room. That's why I like hanging out at the Elders Action Network and living in Palm Springs during the winters, because it's not the case. But that was a shift for me. And I thought, what do I have? I don't have the same vitality to offer, but maybe I have some wisdom to offer. Not in a know-it-all way, but maybe these years of experience had some value as a mentor, as a teacher, as a coach to others on their journey in a different way. So anyway, those are some of the things for me.
Well, John, thank you very much. That's a very insightful. Now, next, I'd like to ask Alon to answer the same question. Describe your experience of transitioning to elderhood. How did this happen, and what were the stages for you?
I can trace it back mostly to health issues that I had in mid-70s, where I had a liver transplant and my activity was reduced very dramatically for several months, almost half a year. And I could ask myself then, and I could have died in the process. So what is mine to do now? I had been a consultant, a coach, working mostly with teams, and always with an objective that was set not by me, but by others to help them achieve that objective. From then on, when I was 74, I saw that I could be of a wider, larger service in the world. Not that what I was doing was not of service, but to use probably a broader range of my capacities than I was, particularly my intuition, my sense of relationship, etc. So I think the first stage was an observation stage of myself. And for instance, I took a couple of courses with the Elders Action Network about what did it mean to live a sustainable life, and then said, well, how can this be reflected in some of the work I take the initiative to do? And that's how I created with you, Jim, the regenerative elder process, which is about helping people ask themselves both the inner questions and the outer questions at the same time. And that stage is now more advanced, is that I can sense that some of the progress or development that I go through as a person helps me ask different questions. For me, an elder asks good questions more than necessarily offers advice directly. So that's for me the next stage, is how does my personal work translates into a different way of being with others and being of service with others. That's what I would say at this time.
Jim, we want to turn the camera around on you for a minute. What's your transition to elderhood been like?
For me, becoming an elder was a surprise. I was doing a ULab, actually the second ULab I ever did. And the first ULab I ever did really dealt with coming up with 5 words: healthy, sustainable, regenerative, resilient living. And I looked out in all of my life, where are the areas I can focus on that? How can I translate those concepts into actions? And I never thought I was old. I always thought I was young. I thought, I kept skiing, I kept hiking and stuff. And all of a sudden in my second ULab course, the concept of what is it to be an elder in the 21st century came on. And I had no idea. I said, well, somebody's got to be doing some work on this somewhere. And so I did a Google search like everybody else would do. And I came up with Elders Action Network. And I said, well, let me go find out what they're doing. What are they? I have no idea what they are. So there was Elders for Regenerative Living. Hey, that's one of my key words. Let me find out what they're doing. I have no idea. And I met the founder, John Sorensen. I got involved with the Elders for Regenerative Living. Once again, not having any idea what that meant and exploring that. And I've been in this process working with Elders Action Network of exploring what is it to be regenerative? What is it to be a regenerative elder? And now even to broaden that concept of what is it to be a regenerative activist elder? Recently, we did a process led by you, John, that we were looking at who do we need to serve in Elders Action Network. And that's sort of what came out of it, this become a regenerative active elder. So it's been a process of discovery and immersion for me. And I'm still looking for it and trying to figure that out. But I want to move to the next area I want to talk about. I want to address this to you, Alon. And what it is, what the tensions have you encountered between savoring life and contributing to the world? John, you spoke about this earlier in your introduction. So, Alon, I know you reflected deeply on the balance between savoring the joys of life while feeling called to contribute meaningful to the world. Given your insights in both the inner and outer journey of elderhood, what tensions have you personally encountered between these two aspects of life? And how do you find space for both enjoyment and engagement in your day-to-day existence?
It's a good question that I'm still struggling with at this time. Interestingly, as I got more and more involved in a program such as the regenerative elder process, I worked harder than I had in previous years because I was so captivated by what I found was the possibility. So yes, I save a life, but my wife can tell me, you could save a life more. And maybe because I've worked pretty hard all my life, it came back to me as an elder that now I do it as a volunteer. I do it to try to be of service to people who are quite different from the people I used to serve in business, for instance. And at the same time, I have to watch out not to overdo it so that my capacity to save a life remains intact. And I'm thinking not just of myself and my passion, but also my wife, my family. And so I can't say that I have found a good balance at this time. But I am aware that sometimes a passion, when it's just a pure passion, something that is not rewarded by money, as you said, John, can be even more captivating and demanding than the regular work. That's where I am now. And I find ways to save a life I love being outdoors. I ride my bike every day. I exercise. I do some stretching in the evening. I take some walks in the woods, etc. But I probably could benefit from doing that a little more, even for the work I'm doing with the EN, for instance.
Thank you, Alain. Well, John, I know you savor life. You love playing baseball. You have all kinds of friends you travel and see. I think you play tennis too.
A lot of tennis, yeah.
And so how do you balance this between savoring life and contributing to the world?
Well, first, I'll double down on something two things Alain said. One is, yes, at our recent podcast retreat, Elise did say that it would be good for Alain to savor life a little more. So, Elise, if you're listening, when you're listening, I'm doing my part here. But the second thing that Alain said is really interesting, and I have found that too, is that when you're an elder and freed, and let's face it, there are some people who still have to work for money in a meaningful way when they retire. And we'll talk, I think, about that a little bit later. But, if that isn't the main driver for you, if you're relatively comfortable, not have to be wealthy, but relatively comfortable, you suddenly have this freedom to do what you want to do. And if you've been a work-oriented person, as the three of us all have been, meaning we all had work that was meaningful to us. None of us worked just for a paycheck. We had that privilege, right? And we did it on our own, but we had that privilege. Not everyone has that. That suddenly now, when you don't have that anymore and there's no structure demanding anything of you, you may find you work even harder. And I've certainly found that, because I'm very passionate about the things that I'm working on around sustainability and around environment and around sustainable society. And you also raised another important thing, Alain, which is often our partners who were not as work-oriented. And that certainly is true for my partner. She's a high school teacher. She's a little younger than me, but also work was not as central in her life, even though she's really good at it and felt she was contributing. So for her, savoring life is really important. So I find, as you said, Alain, for those of us who really have these passions, we have to balance the needs of those who love us as well for us to savor. But also, again, just double down on one other point Alain said. I find if I am working too hard at this stage of life, and frankly, it was true at every stage of my life, if I wasn't savoring, I wasn't really as effective at the contributing anyway. So I think at whatever stage you're at, if you're not savoring and feeding the soul and deepening yourself and your experience of living, you're not going to serve as well. And one good example for me is when I started taking one day a week, when I didn't do anything that I considered work, even these passions that I have, because for many years, every day of the week, to some extent, I would be working. And I have found it so freeing to have that one day of week. In this case, it's tomorrow, Saturday. It's either Saturday or Sunday. That day, I will not do anything that looks like work. And I find I'm more excited when I come back. So I think that this is true at every age, but certainly as an elder, I found that an important piece. But I do play hard and work hard, but I've always done that. But now, time is shorter. I'm a lot more careful about the things I invest in, both in work and in savoring. And maybe that's one thing about elderhood I have found is that as an older person, you have less time. You have less time. So I'm a lot more discriminating about where I do my savoring and where I do my working. And I think that's a good thing. I think all of us should do that even at a much younger age, be very discerning about where we put our energies.
Thank you, John. And that leads right into my next topic that I want to, before I do that, let me talk about savoring life for myself. I love the outdoors. I'm a skier, hiker, backpacker, sea kayaker. My passion has always been the outdoors. I was a park ranger in the summers. And so I just love that. And I find my solace out there. So how does that work with elders? Well, I belong to an organization called the Mountaineers, and we lead hikes. There's hikes and all kinds of trips. Now, what happens is we all slow down as elders. And I was finding it harder and harder to keep up with these younger people. I mean, they just have all the energy, they can go all day, and that's fine. But I don't anymore. So what I did is I chose to become a leader. So I can lead hike. I just led a hiking trip yesterday, and it's focused on elder pace. My pace is, we paced 1.8, 1.7 miles per hour. We did 10 miles, went up 1,600 feet. And so for those people like us who still love the outdoors and want to spend time there, we have to go at it. We have to set a different pace. And there was nobody in the organization doing that. And so I advertised my trips as senior trips and a slower pace. And it's open to all members. So new members who haven't done a lot of hiking can go with elders who've done a lot of hiking and learn from them. So I'm structuring trips where you can interact with the elders and learn from their wisdom. And what we don't want to do is we don't want to age out of hiking or age out of skiing. We want to do that as long as we can to bring the joy that it has to us. So that's what I'm doing in an organization, is creating a space for elders that they can still do these activities, but then they can invite other new members who would like to learn from their wisdom. So that's what I've been around, still savoring, taking the things I loved and doing and making them available to everybody.
And having been in Jim's garage, we should post a picture on the website of Jim's garage at some point, because like Jim has like more backpacks than I've owned in 3 previous lifetimes because of all the different kinds of hiking trips that he takes. And it's just a kaleidoscope of outdoor paraphernalia, but he uses it all. It's not like it's just sitting idly there. And I really admire that about you, Jim. But I love what you said too about, an older person years ago, when I was only in my early 50s, said to me, as you get older, you've got to lean into the octave of the stage of life you're in. So, it might be a stage of our life when competing on being the first one up the mountain. That's the octave, that one. I'm not saying that was true for you, Jim, but it might be true for some people. But I love how you said, I leaned into I still want hiking to be an important part of my life, but I'm not now the aggressive first person up the mountain with the different generations. So you leaned into something that was a way of continuing your passion in the octave that you're in. It makes me think of my 89-year-old friend, Gene, in Palm Springs, who's played singles tennis all of his life, 5 or 6 days a week, even in his, late 80s, finally now going to play doubles. And even though he doesn't really like doubles, but what I love about that is like watching him surrender to, it was okay not to be the guy who played singles anymore. So I love, Jim, what you just shared with us, because I think it's important as we get older to realize it's okay to sing in the octave that is this stage. E-bikes help if you're a biker, my older friends say, because then you keep up with the young people. They're riding regular bikes and you can pass them.
Well, John, I love how you frame that. That is a perfect frame, and I learned something from that frame. But I want to dive a little deeper into what you were talking before. And I want to go more about the relationship to time, ambition, goal setting as it evolved in your elderhood. So, John, you lived a life full of purpose, success, and goal setting. You have, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 books or whatever it is. I'm curious to know how your relationship to time and ambition has evolved now that you've transitioned into elderhood. What drives you today? Has your approach to success or setting goals changed? And how do you balance your ambition with the awareness that time now is more precious than ever?
Well, that's a big question. I guess a couple of things. I think I've often said to people, there are 2 great tasks of life. In the first half of your life, the great task is to find yourself. Who am I? What's important to me? What am I passionate about? What's my purpose? What is the tempo and the melody of a life that is joyful for me, and align with that? But I've often thought, at the second half of life, the great task is to disappear. And what I mean by that, we will, of course, physically disappear, but to really melt into the oneness, to realize that your status, your ambition, all the things you take from the world, all the accolades you get will really be meaningless in the end. But if you can melt into the oneness, melt into a cause that's bigger than yourself that will go on after you leave, right? So for me, when I walked the Camino the first time, there's a place on the Camino where you leave a rock. It's one of the highest parts on the Camino, in the Camino de Santiago in northern Spain. For those of you who don't know, is a pilgrimage that people have been taking for over 1,000 years from the south of France to the coast of the Atlantic in Spain, for all kinds of reasons. Originally a religious pilgrimage for Christians. Now people of all persuasions walk. But make a long story short, at this highest part in the Camino, there's a place with these thousands and thousands of rocks that people have left over the centuries. And the idea is to bring a rock from home and to leave it there, and to leave it with the intention of something you want to leave behind in your life. And I had my rock. I didn't know what I wanted to leave behind. But when I got there, I had two thoughts. One is I thought, wow, look at all these thousands of rocks, right? How unimportant my rock is. And some people had colored their rock, left notes on their rock that had long since blown away, or the colors had disappeared and the writing was gone. And then I had a more beautiful thought: how beautiful to surrender my need to be a special rock, but to just know that I'm a part of this conversation that's been going on for thousands of years. And if I can do my part in my lifetime and just join the oneness of all these beautiful people, and I can honestly say at the 90% level, I left my ambition on that mountain on the Camino. And it was so freeing to no longer evaluate myself in terms of how I stacked up to others, or how many books I'd written, or how many books sold, how much money I made, or how much difference I made, just to be a rock and do my part. And that's what I mean by disappearing. It's not disappearing in terms of, oh, I don't matter. It's actually just to join the oneness and realize that you're a part of a conversation so much bigger than you. Because I think when you die, if you've disappeared before you die, you'll disappear with grace, because you know you're a part of this great oneness. So why be afraid of disappearing? Because you've already disappeared. Anyway, I waxed too philosophical, but that for me is the moment I feel I surrendered ambition. And it still comes back once in a while, but I'm able to usually nudge it aside. And it's very freeing to let go of that kind of ambition, which is different than wanting to contribute.
John, that's beautiful. I mean, I'm just touched. It's incredible. I love what you said. So, Alon, how about you? What's your relationship to time, ambition, and goal setting now? You, having worked with you a lot, there's a lot of goal setting around the courses you're designing and teaching. How's your relationship to all that changed?
Well, I would say that the major shift for me has occurred. I was with McKinsey and these high goal setting companies. So a good part of my life has been dominated by goal setting, including for myself. Although I was most of the time I was a solo practitioner, so I could actually adapt my own goal setting to where I was at the time. But what has changed is that I ask a different question now. I ask, what is my gift to give at this time? And so that may then translate, well, I want to complete this program or do this or do that. But actually, it's more of a conversation where with myself and others, because now I try to work much more in groups than I used to, is to say, what is the stone I can add to use John's image? But it doesn't have to be necessarily the most remarkable stone. It's be one stone that will fit into what is being offered. And I've experienced that, Jim, in our collaboration, for instance, in a regenerative elder process, that each person has contributed something that probably uses a good part of their unique gift, and at the same time do it together. So when John was speaking of his experience on El Camino, I could really resonate with that. There was a time where, and that's where I think the heart is more involved than the mind in deciding where to put my efforts into. and see how it blends into something that is much wider than I could offer myself. So that has been a gradual shift, I would say. And the notion of goal, especially the short-term goal, has probably waned in the background. It's more of a long-term perspective of saying, when I'm on my deathbed, what would I like to say of myself in these last few years? To what extent have I contributed my gift in a way that honors what needs to be done and what each person brings?
Thank you very much, Alon. That's also beautiful. And I'm honored here to sit with you. And the work you've done on the regenerative elder process has been magnificent. And I'm lucky to be part of it.
Jim, I just want to say something about what you said, Alon. I thought it was a beautiful image. It doesn't have to be the most remarkable stone. And I think one of the freedoms, the greatest freedoms we can give ourselves at any stage of life, but especially in elderhood, but it is to let go of the need for our stone to be remarkable in anyone's eyes, except for our own, except for a sense that we have been our most true self and contributed the stone that we are most able and gifted to give, which is all any of us can do. And, we live in a world now where we often judge ourselves by how many likes we have, or, how many shares people give of things we put on social media, or how many accolades we get. And I just think this idea of not having to have your stone be remarkable, but is that stone my stone? Is that really me being my most authentic self? Am I contributing the best that I can to the greater cause? I think that is one of the great gifts of elderhood. Now, not everyone, you can hold on to that ambition and that ego, like a monkey holding on to the sweet in the jar, but you'll find you can't get your hand out until you let it go. And that's what happens in elderhood. I think until you let go of that, I don't think you can really be free. And again, I think that's true at every age, but it's really true, I think, when you're an elder. So thank you, Alon, for that image of it doesn't have to be a remarkable stone, because I saw so many of those people who tried so hard to make their stone remarkable. And guess what? Now it's unremarkable because time eroded it anyway. And now it's just like every other stone. But at the time, that stone meant something to them. And that's what matters in this present moment, right?
Thank you, John. For me, around this topic is that much of my life, I felt like I was not enough. I felt that I often had to prove myself to myself and to others. And one thing about when becoming an elder is that developing, I don't care what anybody thinks about me anymore. I've already done everything I need to do. I've proven myself to myself. So it's not about being enough. It's about doing what's right, doing what's needed. And because time is short, I'm the oldest male in 3 generations. So every other male in the last 2 generations before me had died by my age. So I call what I have extra credit. And with extra credit, it's important to do the work that's important, that you've been called to do. For example, recently I had an opportunity to run for the town council, and I decided not to do it because I love my town and there's lots of important things, but there's some very important work I need to focus on. Climate change, being a elder. I only have so much time. And so I really want to deal with the issues and problems that are facing us that I think I can do the most work on. And so I chose not to take that opportunity, and I'm okay with that. So what we want to move on to next is sort of what came out of a recent workshop that John led and we worked on, and we looked at a concept. At least this is a concept that came up with me. It's called regenerative activist elder. And for me, the idea of becoming a regenerative activist elder has been central to my transition to elderhood. It's about using the wisdom of our years, not just to enjoy life, but to contribute meaningful to solving the global challenges like climate change. This has become a guiding principle for me. I see elderhood as a time to regenerate both personally and collectively. So let me share what that concept means to all of us and how I found purpose in my stage of life. John or Alon, do you want to comment about that concept, regenerative activist elder?
Sure, I can get started. And I do want to go back to one thing Alon said that I think is really, maybe it's a difference between us. I don't know, Alon, but maybe not. I'll test this out with you guys. When I was earlier in my life, I always had all these long-term goals. And I always think of my grandfather used to tell that joke about the guy who came to sell him long-term bonds. And I'm sure my grandfather didn't make that up, but that he didn't even buy green bananas anymore at the grocery store. He told the guy, so forget the long-term bonds. I find my goals now are much closer in. And I think that even so many younger people get so obsessed on their long-term goals that they forget that our long-term goals are usually the result of achieving shorter-term goals. And that staying focused in the next months, the next year, that's how you achieve long-term goals. And I just find for me, I do a lot less long-term goal planning because I don't know if I'll be here in 10 years. Because like you guys don't necessarily have longevity in the family. But to that question about regenerative activist elder, going back to my experience in Tanzania, it started me asking the question, well, what is an elder anyway? And obviously you're not an elder just because you're old. So we say respect your elders, but that's a phrase we use. But the truth is we all know older people who we don't respect. We may still respect that they've lived for a long time. We may still respect that they have been around and they're older than us. But I think when we say respect our elders, what we really mean is I respect this person because they have some wisdom, because they've learned something from living, because at this stage of their life, they are contributing to all generations. So the first thing that comes to mind to me is really asking the question, well, what is an elder versus an older person? We're all going to get old, but we may not all become elders. And to me, what is an elder is the first question. And to me, an elder is someone who has learned something from life, from their mistakes and from their victories, and has something and is willing and devoted to sharing that with others. Second, an elder is someone who realizes that I have a responsibility to the next generations, that the pile of stones will continue. People will walk the Camino after me. The rest of life will have a life after me, all of nature. And how am I contributing to that? Because I won't be around. How am I leaving a legacy, and not in an ego way, but in a contributory way? And I think we'll talk about this difference between maybe being an activist and being regenerative, which to me is about you could do lots of work in the world, but never do the work inside that's required for you to be fully integrated. In the more Hindu tradition, this idea that I might take this into the next iteration, right? And so am I fulfilling my deepest sense of self in this lifetime? So to me, there's regenerative in one sense. Is the world better off? Is all of life better off because of how I'm living my life in the personal way and the things I'm working on? But also there's regenerative in this sense of, am I becoming my fullest internal self that I can be before I pass on to whatever comes next? And I think that's the difference for me. You could be really active and not fully integrate internally, or you could be really meditate all day long and become the most enlightened internal elder ever known to humanity and have contributed little in the outer world to that pile of stones and life being better. So that's the tension for me. Can we do both those pieces of work? And I think you got to earn being an elder, but you're going to get old no matter what.
Thank you, John. Before we go to Alon, I want to frame this a little bit. When I'm talking about being a regenerative activist elder, I'm referring to a concept that goes beyond the traditional roles or expectations of aging. Regeneration in this context is about renewing, restoring, and fostering conditions where life, whether biological, social, or environmental, can thrive and sustain itself. It's a proactive stance focused on creating systems, relationships, and practices that are not just sustainable, but actively contribute to the long-term flourishing of life. I want to ask Alon, what do you think about this concept of regenerative activist elder?
Well, for me, the word, I'll start with regenerative. for me, regenerative is indeed, as Paul Hawken likes to say, putting life at the center of every decision I make. Is my decision going to be helping life move forward and in all its possibilities or not? Another aspect of, and that goes maybe to the notion of wisdom. Wisdom is, for me, starting by listening a lot, observing a lot, before we utter some advice or some suggestions. And listening is not just listening to what the other says, but also listening to what is trying to come through me from the field. And I know this may sound a little bit esoteric, but to what extent am I a channel for something that is coming through me, through my voice, through my actions, in a way that it's not, my ego is not involved? It's more being a good voice for something that needs to be voiced now. And that includes, Jim, some of the fundamental changes that need to be made in a community or in society. For instance, asking, does our community sustain life or helps life flourish by, for instance, letting go of the most obvious consumerist attitudes that we have, opening to what are the needs that are not met yet, needs of the heart, I would say, the sense of belonging, the sense of being part of something larger. So regeneration also includes that dimension of going within or accepting to be just a vehicle for what is trying to happen. And by listening enough, by observing enough, not be in a reactive mode. That is sometimes what we see in social life. So I'm not sure I'm finding the right words to say it, but the activist part, the activist comes at a point where I have a sense that I have put my finger on some things that are essential, may have been neglected so far, and could be further developed, further taken care of in the future.
Well, thank you, Alain. Let me take what both John and Alain has said and kind of bring that together in contrast here. So the activist elder takes more of a hands-on approach. They are not just passive source of wisdom, but actively involved in societal issues, whether it's environmental protection, social justice, or political activism. They use their life experience to push for change. The activist elders engage in making differences in the world by leveraging their wisdom and energy to address pressing issues. A very important role, very important role. And a lot of elders are doing that right now. But what's the contrast? What makes it different? In my mind, a regenerative activist elder goes a step further. It's not just about wisdom or activism, but about fostering a deeper level of systemic change that is self-sustaining and life-enhancing. It's about engaging with the world in a way that contributes to long-term solutions, creating a system and relationships that regenerate themselves and support the thriving of future generations. This type of elder not only addresses problems, but also seeks to restore and build new systems that will continue to flourish long after we're gone. In my own life, I see this as a commitment to healthy, regenerative, resilient, sustainable living, both personally and collectively. It's about looking beyond just solving problems today and ensuring that systems we build will regenerate and support life for generations to come. So I think that's important. I'm really resonating. I think I found, for me, what being an elder in the 21st century is really being a regenerative activist elder. So I want to take these last few minutes, next 10 minutes or so, and just throw it open for an open discussion between the three of us about what we talked about today, what ideas we presented, and how does that influence our podcast and what we're doing ourselves as elders in relationship with Elders Active Network. John, why don't you jump on that first?
Well, I reflect for a moment, Jim, on what you were sharing a moment ago. And I think of that beautiful book, Braiding Sweetgrass, where there's kind of this arresting moment when she really kind of takes on the idea of sustainability in a kind of negative way, in saying, well, if sustainability means just to keep doing what we're doing, that isn't really what we're aiming for. It's not really what it's about. And to me, this question of, a number of years when I walked the Camino, I came back with a renewed definition of my own purpose, which was to help contribute to the shift of consciousness and behavior required for humanity and planet to thrive now and in the future. And to me, that is the heart of this regenerative idea you're sharing, Jim, is like, am I contributing to a shift of consciousness and a shift of behavior that will allow all of life to thrive in all the ways that life, can thrive? And in many ways, Janine Benuis, who we had on who I love, the great biologist who lives in Montana, a biomimicry fame, reminded me that the rest of life, other than humanity, acts as if its purpose is to keep life going and make it better. And I think that is our purpose, right? And so I think that sustainability is, well, can we just kind of keep doing what we're doing now? Well, I think what we're doing now isn't working at a lot of levels. There are a lot of people left behind. Whole society is left behind. The rest of nature has been raped and pillaged for our benefit as if its sole purpose was to serve humanity. I could go on, but like that, I don't want to sustain the degradation of all the rest of the living biosphere so I can thrive. That's not regenerative to all of life. So we could go deeper into that, but I think that there is something deeper than just the sustainability of the life we're living in the developed world, which is probably what many people mean by sustainability is, can we just keep doing what we're doing as long as we can possibly do it? And that's certainly not, to me, what we're trying to do in this podcast. We're trying to really ask, how could it really be regenerative in the deepest sense for all of life, including humanity?
I'm going to address that in a minute, but I want to go to Alon for any words about this. Any thoughts?
Well, I would add that activism, or being an activist without being regenerative, may just lead to reacting to what is within the definition of what is. In other words, the regenerative aspect goes to challenge some of the foundations of what is, the beliefs, the assumption about human nature, all the things that actually we know can be challenged. So the willingness to challenge first, to go to the, if we call it the root causes, or some of the essential elements that have remained untouched because they are so against the common mood or grain. And this is why we insist on the word regenerative as, of course, starting with oneself, but then looking at what needs to change fundamentally and starting with some of the beliefs we have, some of the worldviews we have, is that actually perpetuate things going as they are. So the capacity to ask the difficult questions, to challenge the status quo, and as a result then engaging in another kind of action than the ones which should be taken if we stay within the definition of the current system, is actually very important.
I think what you said was so important, Alon, because I think one of the things about being a regenerative elder is challenging the assumptions your operating system has had your whole life. And because we've reached this point now that the way we've been doing things is not working anymore. So you have to really be willing to challenge your assumptions. So why are we doing all this? Why are Alon and John doing this podcast? Because of the crisis we're in. John Rockstrom, who wrote the book on tipping points, just did a TED Talk. And he laid out, we have 5 years before some of these tipping points will be beyond salvage. And so in the next 5 years, which as seniors, that's a major part of what time we have left. We need to be doing something. We need to be influencing our communities, influencing our government, influencing our friends and modeling all that. And I think the concept of a regenerative activist elder really gives us a model, an idea to move forward to, not to just be reactive to whatever we need to do in the moment, but what do we need to do for the long term? What do we need to do for substantial changes that are going to be here long after we live? So we've got about 4 or 5 minutes. Anything, Alon or John?
Well, Jim, something you said really flagged for me. So someone is listening and they're, let's say, at this stage of life, or they have someone in their life who's meaningful to them, who's at that stage of life. What's the question that we might want to be asking ourselves? And here's the question I would put out as a challenge to our listeners and to ourselves, is how I am using my time, my resources, my gifts, and my voice, contributing to a more regenerative, positive future for humanity and for the rest of life. I'll say that again. Is the way I'm using my time, my resources, my gifts, and my voice contributing to a regenerative future for all of humanity and for all of life? And to me, if you want to be a regenerative elder, or want to be regenerative at any stage of your life, that's the question you ought to be asking yourself. And none of us will be perfect at it. Like we are not setting ourselves up on this podcast as the paragons of virtues. We're not asking for statues of us. We know we don't deserve them. We're on the journey with you. We're on that camino with you. Camino literally means the way in Spanish. We're on that way with you, asking, what is the way forward for humanity, for a regenerative future for planet and for humanity? And what is the way forward for each one of us to have a full life and contribute to that reality? And that's what this podcast, to me, Jim, which is the question you asked, is all about. Why are we doing this? Because we want a regenerative future for humanity and planet. And we want each one of us, whatever age we are, to fulfill our deepest possibility for joy and to do this work with others, which is really generational legacy work in my mind.
Once again, John, you're so eloquent. It's beautiful. I just love what you just said. I want to go to Alon for a minute, and then we're going to start our closing out. Alon, any last words?
Yes, I love John's question, and I would add a second question. Knowing that this work is very difficult to do by oneself. And we find that very much in the regenerative elder process, that when I start doing it with others who may be very different from me, but have some similar questions, there is a stimulation and an encouragement that comes to challenge. And it's difficult to challenge one's own assumption by oneself. And we find that the notion of doing this in community, it doesn't have to be a very large community, but the same way we've encouraged each other within this triad to move forward, to generate forward. How can we? So I'm not walking the camino of the way alone. I'm trying to find companions who are willing to ask the same questions and walk that way as well. And this will probably enhance very much what I'm trying to do on my own. So that's the second question I would add. Have I found, or am I looking for the people that I can do this both inner work and outer work together with?
So I think you identified this is a collective experience. We're an interdependent species. We're at our best when we work together to take on the crises. And I just have to say, it's been an honor and a privilege to work with John, and Alon in this podcast. I learn something new every time. And I'm not ever sure what's going to emerge. And it's usually really interesting, provocative, and wild and possible. So I'm going to ask John to close us out.
So first of all, I agree with the two of you. Such a privilege to do this work together. To those who want to get a little insight into us, we just had our first in-person retreat with each of our spouses, the 6 of us on a lake for a couple of days and hiking and enjoying meals and swimming together in Mercer Lake in Southern Oregon. It was such a joy. We have 3 partners who are all truly our better halves, and too bad you don't see them. And Jim, it's so great to have you in the studio. I always love it when you come out from behind the computer and join us. It's always a privilege and a great addition. And a couple of things. If you are someone who says, I'd like to be in a community of people who are thinking this way about this stage of life, who are both active and regenerative, doing the inner and the outer work, please, the Elders Action Network, one of our sponsors, an organization we're involved in, Elders Climate Action, another one of our co-sponsors, 2 great places to find that community and opportunities both for the inner and the outer form of the activism around regeneration. I really encourage you to do that. And if you need a personal coach, because often we need somebody to coach us through it, we do that kind of work as well, meaning the 3 of us. But let me just go back to that tribe in Iraq, in Tanzania, the Iraq tribe, where they said, how does the Council of Elders work in your society? And I don't think we'll ever have a formal Council of Elders in our society, at least not in our lifetime. But we can have a virtual Council of Elders by more and more of us at this stage of life deciding that we will use our time, our resources, our talents, our voice, our inner life to be in community with each other to make all of life better because we were here. And let me just remind you, we only get one chance with that stone, at least as far as we know in this lifetime. As David White, the great poet, says, if there is another life, it is probably so unlike this life that it really doesn't matter. You've only got one of this kind of life. And make sure, whatever age you are, you use it wisely to be your truest self and to make the truest difference you can for all of life. So once again, we thank you. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe to our podcast on YouTube and on Apple and other forms. Let us know that you're listening. It means a lot to us. We love your feedback. And if you'd like us to do better in some way, we'd love to hear from you. Meanwhile, we always end this podcast by reminding you that history is not a destination waiting for us to arrive. In this critical moment, what someday people will call history will be what we do today. For now, we'll see you next time on The Way Forward. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for joining us in this episode of the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast. I'm Jim Burke, the producer. We'd like to extend our heartfelt thanks to our sponsors, Elders Action Network and Elders Climate Action, for their unwavering support in making this podcast possible. Their dedication to empowering elders to take action on climate change and social justice issues is truly inspiring. If you found this conversation as enlightening and motivating as we did, please subscribe to our podcast and YouTube channels. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these vital discussions to a broader audience. Don't forget to share this episode with your network, and let's work together to build a better world for all generations. Find us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, and now on Instagram and YouTube Shorts. Together, we can make a difference. We'd love to hear your feedback on today's episode and any suggestions you have for future guests. Please send your thoughts and recommendations to thewayforwardrc@gmail.com. Your input is invaluable in helping us shape the future of this podcast. To learn more about our sponsors and get involved, visit Elders Action Network at eldersaction.org and Elders Climate Action at eldersclimateaction.org. Thank you for being part of the Way Forward community.